At first, it felt like ginger ale in my skull.
Do you feel depressed?
Since the ducks left, I guess.
Tony Soprano is one of the most terrifying men ever put on television. He's a murderer, a criminal, a man who built an empire by making people afraid of him, and yet the moment that breaks him isn't losing money, power, or a war with another family. It's a family of ducks leaving his backyard. Because that scene reveals the entire reason Tony Soprano became one of the greatest characters in television history. He's a man powerful enough to control everyone around him, but powerless against himself. Most TV characters are consistent. They have a set of traits, and those traits produce behavior, and you watch the behavior and understand the character. It's clean and satisfying, and it works. Tony Soprano isn't consistent. He's a contradictory in ways that feel genuinely uncomfortable rather than dramatically convenient.
Someday soon, you're gonna have families of your own. And if you're lucky, you remember the little moments. Like this. That were good.
He loves his family. He also cheats on his wife constantly with a casualness that suggests he doesn't experience much guilt about it until he does. He's capable of genuine warmth, and also capable of sudden, disproportionate cruelty toward those same people when they stop being useful to him or stop representing something he can't control. He is smart, and specifically smart about people. He reads rooms, manages personalities, and spots weaknesses and strengths in the people around him with an accuracy that's almost clinical. And he uses that intelligence almost entirely in service of avoiding the one thing that could actually help him, which is an honest accounting of who he is and what he's done. The reason audiences connect with him isn't admiration, it's recognition.
You get stabbed in the ribs. That's painful. This shit, I don't feel nothing. Dead. Empty.
Not of the mob boss, most people don't have that to draw from, but of the contradiction itself. The way we protect our self-image even when the self-image is obviously wrong. Tony Soprano is a monster who is also painfully, specifically, recognizably human, and the show never lets you forget either half of that sentence. Tony isn't just carrying a criminal empire. Every part of his life demands a different version of him. He's one man at work, another with Carmela, another with AJ, and it goes on. The real pressure isn't keeping the business together. It's keeping all those different versions of himself from colliding. Every single one of those roles demands something different from him. Every single one of them requires a different version of Tony to show up. And the show's greatest structural achievement is watching those versions slowly become impossible to reconcile. Watch season 1 Tony, and then watch season 6 Tony, and you're watching two different men. Season 1 Tony still has something that resembles optimism. He starts therapy. He engages at least partially with the idea that he might be able to understand himself better. He has relationships that feel like they have room to breathe. He makes decisions that feel like they have actual thought behind them. Season 6 Tony is almost completely sealed. The therapy has become a ritual he performs rather than a process he engages with. The relationships have narrowed to either people who can be used or people who represent threats. The decisions come from a place of pure self-preservation, and the self he's preserving has less and less in common with the person he might have been. What happened in between is the cost of leadership. Every decision Tony makes creates consequences, and because he's the boss, those consequences come back to him. People who were trusted turn out not to be. Every alliance creates an obligation, and every obligation eventually becomes a vulnerability. Trust, which was never easy for Tony, becomes practically impossible, because trust in his world isn't just emotionally risky, it's physically dangerous.
What am I supposed to trust you, you fucking off the reservation cocks?
And so he closes down. The version of himself that was capable of genuine openness retreats so far it eventually becomes inaccessible even to him. That's not a metaphor, that's the actual mechanism of what the show documents. Power in The Sopranos doesn't corrupt in some abstract philosophical sense. It isolates. It forces the person at the center into a position where every human relationship becomes a transaction, and where the only way to survive is to stop being the kind of person who needs things from other people. Tony doesn't fully achieve that, and the inability to fully achieve it is what destroys him. Dr. Melfi is one of the most interesting figures in the show, precisely because of what she represents and what she fails to accomplish. She enters Tony's life at the moment he's most vulnerable. The panic attacks are new, the ducks have left, and something in his psychology has cracked open enough that he walks into her office and stays. And she's genuinely talented. She identifies things accurately and makes connections, and yet it doesn't work, not in the way she intends. What happens instead is something more specific and more troubling. Tony is smart enough to understand the language of therapy, cause and effect, childhood wounds. Tony becomes remarkably good at explaining himself. The problem is that explanation slowly replaces change, because understanding something and choosing to change because of that understanding are two different things, and Tony never gets to the second part. The therapy gives him insight. What it doesn't give him is the responsibility that comes with insight. The point where you can no longer say, I am this way because of what happened to me, and have to start asking, what am I going to do about it? Melfi eventually realizes this. The research she reads in a later season makes the case explicitly. Therapy with certain personality types doesn't rehabilitate, it educates. It makes them better at understanding the tools of manipulation and self-justification. Tony becomes, across the run of the show, increasingly effective at explaining himself to himself in ways that require no change. The Tony and Carmela dynamic is one of the most honest depictions of a complicated marriage in television history, which is partly why it's so uncomfortable to watch. They love each other, that part is real, and there are moments between them that only exist between people who have actually built something together over years. The love isn't performed, it's just insufficient, because alongside the love lives a resentment that neither of them can fully look at. Carmela resents what she's had to accept to live the life Tony provides. Tony resents being resented, and also at some level understands the resentment is deserved, which makes him resent it more. They use each other, they protect each other. The marriage survives the show not because it's fixed, but because neither of them can figure out how to exit it without losing more than they'd gain. This relationship is where the show does some of its most interesting work. Christopher is Tony's nephew, and functionally the son Tony chose, mentored, protected, and shaped, and that investment comes from a real place. Tony sees something in Christopher, potential maybe, or maybe just a version of himself that he could steer differently than he was steered. The problem is that Tony's investment in Christopher is also fundamentally about Tony. He wants Christopher to succeed in ways that reflect well on him. When Christopher struggles, Tony's response is less about Christopher's well-being and more about how Christopher's failure reflects on Tony's judgment. The relationship was always going to end badly, because Christopher was never just a person to Tony, he was a project, and when the project stopped going the way Tony wanted, the affection underneath it wasn't strong enough to survive the disappointment. Tony looks at AJ and sees the thing he fears most about himself, the sensitivity, the anxiety. AJ is proof that whatever Tony went through to become who he is, whatever was done to him, whatever he did to himself, it didn't fully take. Something soft survived in him, and it came out in his son. He doesn't know what to do with that. He tries to toughen AJ up in the clumsy, counterproductive way of a man who was toughened up himself, and has never questioned whether that was actually good for him. Yet it doesn't work. AJ remains sensitive. He has his own breakdown. Tony recognizes and can't help, because the only tools Tony has for dealing with this kind of pain are the tools he used to bury his own. This is the Tony people see. Decisive, funny, in the specific way of someone who can read a room and knows exactly which joke lands with which person at which moment. Generous when it suits him. Intimidating when it needs to be. The man who handles things, who shows up, who has an answer, or who creates the impression of having one. And then there's the Tony who exits underneath. Terrified, specifically terrified of insignificance. Desperate for validation from people whose opinions he'd never admit to caring about. Genuinely uncertain, much of the time, about whether the choices he's made have added up to something worth having made. In the early seasons, these two versions of Tony are close enough together that he can move between them with some fluency. The cracks show, but he can usually get the public Tony back online quickly enough that the private Tony stays manageable. By the end of the show, the distance between them has become enormous. The public Tony is a performance he delivers because he has to, not because it connects to anything underneath. The private Tony is so buried under years of suppression and behavior he can't fully reckon with that it barely surfaces except in the most extreme moments. And the show makes the argument quietly that this gap is the most destructive thing in his life. Not even the FBI, and not the people that want to kill him. The distance he created from himself. The panic attacks start with the ducks, and the show is careful about this. Dr. Melfi makes the connection explicit early. The ducks represent the family, the fear of losing the family, but that's the surface reading. The deeper reading is that the panic attacks are symptoms of the one thing Tony cannot solve with power or intelligence. He is living two incompatible lives. These two lives exist in the same body, drawing on the same nervous system, and the panic attacks are what happen when the nervous system finally refuses to pretend they're compatible. Every panic attack in the show is at its core Tony's body forcing an acknowledgement that his mind refuses to make, that what he is and what he wants to be are in fundamental conflict, and that conflict has a cost that he can absorb for years but never fully eliminate. Tony has opportunities to change across the run of the show. real ones, like moments where the path looks at least partially open, yet he never truly takes them. And it's worth understanding why, because it's not simple cowardice or simple addiction to the light, it's something more specific. Changing would require Tony to accept that the things he's done were wrong in a way that implicates him personally rather than being explained away by circumstance or necessity. He can intellectually understand that certain actions were harmful. He cannot make the step where you stop explaining and start taking actual responsibility, because taking actual responsibility would mean becoming someone other than who he is. And who he is, however much it cost him, is the only self he has. The identity he built through whatever combination of trauma and choice is the foundation everything else sits on. Remove it and there's nothing underneath. That's not a justification, it's a diagnosis. Tony can't change, not because change is impossible, but because change requires a kind of self-confrontation that he has spent his entire life building elaborate defenses against. The intelligence goes into protecting the identity rather than examining it. He is exactly who he decided to be, and that decision was made so long ago that by the time the show ends, it's no longer really a choice. It's just what he is. This has to be the most discussed ending in television history, and most of the discussion misses the point. Whether Tony dies in that diner doesn't matter. The show has already made its argument before the screen goes dark. Everything Tony spent years protecting has already disappeared, or been corrupted beyond recovery. What he couldn't survive was the inside. The ending works because it doesn't resolve anything. It just stops, the way a life stops, without answers and without redemption. The ducks leave in the pilot. Tony never quite recovers from it, and neither do we. And if you did enjoy this video, make sure to subscribe, as I do upload videos every week on this channel.